You're watching Let the Quran Speak. We recently sat down with Dr. Barbara Perry to discuss her research findings on Islamophobia. Dr. Perry is studying the nature, extent, and implications of Islamophobic hate crimes in Canada. She's Associate Dean and Professor in the Faculty of Criminology, Justice, and Policy Studies at the University of Ontario Institute of Technology. Here is our interview with Dr. Perry. So, Dr. Barbara Perry, thank you so much for talking to us today.
Thank you for inviting me. Yeah, it's a good chance.
To begin with, can you maybe tell me what Islamophobia is, a definition perhaps?
It starts really with the sentiment. So the negative sentiment, the demonization of Muslims and Islam generally. And I think that for me, what's important is the escalation then from the sentiment and the negative attitudes and negative perceptions into violence. And when I talk about violence, I'm really talking about, sort of the whole array from verbal violence all the way up to extreme physical violence. So we talk about Islamophobia being the sentiment, and then the Islamophobic violence that is of concern to me in the project that I'm working on in particular.
Is it phobia, or is it a hate,
a
hatred sort of thing?
It's a phobia for me, we talk about homophobia, for example, and that because it means irrational fear. And I don't think it's necessarily an irrational fear, given that it's perpetuated by, government rhetoric, political rhetoric, that sort of thing. So there's some rationality, if you will. But I think it's really about hostility. There is some fear, again, given the messages that we get of, the risk of Harper's favorite, Islamicization. And but I think that it really is hostility grounded in ignorance, a lot of ignorance, just not knowing, not having a lot of interaction with Muslims, and not having direct knowledge of what Islam is, and relying on the media and the politicians to tell us what that is. And it's typically mythical and false and all negative. Yeah.
You've done research into Islamophobia. You've spoken to individuals who are victims of it. How does it manifest itself? What are the different forms of Islamophobia that you've experienced or seen amongst individuals?
It runs the gamut. The bulk of it really is the sort of verbal violence, the harassment, the name calling, telling people to go back to their country. Coming to women who are covered and saying, "This is Canada, you really don't have to wear that here." And those sorts of really insensitive sorts of things, as well as the really mean-spirited comments about not belonging, about being terrorists and all those sorts of things. So the bulk really has been at that lower level, but you see the escalation, you see the whole gamut. So a lot of pushing and shoving, throwing things at people, spitting in their face, which can there be a worse affront for Muslims? So those sorts of things, physical attacks as well, and then there's the property offenses that are attacks, vandalism, arson, bombings against mosques or Muslim centers, any sort of agents or any sort of building associated with the Muslim community can become targeted. And I've heard lots of stories of that. And that's especially traumatic for a community, because it's an attack on, it really is on the whole community, not just an individual, but it sends a message to everyone who visits there, everyone who's a part of that. Yeah.
What about, Islamophobia not directed towards an individual, but let's say political rhetoric against Muslims?
Yeah, it's disturbing to me as a Canadian to see that beginning to emerge in Canada. I was saying earlier, I was always very smug when I was working with my Australian and British colleagues who would talk about how horrible it was in their countries, and I would read their newspapers and I'd just think, you can say that publicly? And to my chagrin, we're beginning to see some of that escalation of negative rhetoric in Canada amongst politicians, and this is something that we really haven't seen in this country. So it's disturbing to me, because not just because of the statements in and of themselves, but the message then that they send to others in Canada that it's okay to say these sorts of things and you can repeat them as well. And then people feed on that. So public perceptions feed off of that negative rhetoric from political leaders as well. So it really becomes a really nasty cycle.
Yeah. Now, what do you think is the impact on Muslims who are experiencing Islamophobia?
Oh, there's a whole array, again, both at the individual level and at the collective level. The immediate reaction is fear. And whether you've been a victim or not, that fear is often there. I talked about fear and paranoia.
Other people being a victim themselves.
Yeah. Because hate crime is meant to be a message crime. It's not just directed towards an individual, but in fact to the whole community. So if I tell you you don't belong, what I'm saying is no one who is like you belongs here, and so it does become sort of a generalized fear, not just for victims, but potential victims as well. And that creates some form of paranoia, so you're always looking over your shoulder, who's in the room with me, who's out on the street, those sorts of things. So that's sort of the first level. And then, again, in the Canadian context, one of the most disturbing sentiments that I see is when people start to question whether they belong here, that they've been told for so many times, go home, go back where you belong, those sorts of things. So you really begin to question your place in this society, and for a multicultural society to produce that sort of sentiment in its citizenry is frightening to me and really disturbing.
I guess some people remove themselves from the public sphere. They, they restrict their movement in some ways.
Begin to segregate themselves. I've talked to people who have moved their whole families out of a neighborhood because of ongoing harassment there. One of the I think most common reactions, though, is among women in particular, who are particularly vulnerable to Islamophobic violence. It's unusual. It's usually men who are victimized, but because women, especially women who are covered, are visible, they become easy targets, if you will. So women really begin to negotiate their identities and change their behaviors and ways of being in the world. They may decide to no longer cover, or more likely to remain in the home, or to remain somehow out of the public sphere so that they don't risk further victimization.
Now, we've talked about the harm to Muslims who are victims, but what about to the wider society as a whole? Is there any sort of harm that Islamophobia brings to them?
Yeah, well, any sort of hate crime or any sort of behavior like this does throw into question our ideals, grand ideals of equality and inclusion and multiculturalism. So it is, I think, a threat to what I say the mantra of multiculturalism. It really does cause not just victims, but I think others who observe this to question if this is the kind of country that we thought it was. And for some, that's they despair and just sort of throw up their hands and give up. For others, though, it makes them fight a little bit harder and react to that and become a little more active, whether they're Muslim or non-Muslim, and try to bridge the divides and practice inclusion themselves. So it can go in either direction.
I guess when you encounter the results of your research, one could ask, well, what can be done to prevent that? Prevent Islamophobia. I'm sure you've asked this question of yourself.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that I have the answer. Yeah,
okay.
As I was saying, part of the problem is grounded in ignorance. So obviously, awareness, enhancing awareness, education is one initiative. I don't hold much store by legislation. I think it's legislating a problem is not typically very effective. So I think it really involves dialogue and exchange and ongoing interaction between communities, and not just faith-based communities, but racialized and ethnic communities as well, because recognizing the diversity of the Muslim community itself, we're sort of, it's not just about Islam, but it's about race very often, and ethnicity as well. So we have to pull all of those pieces together in those sorts of dialogues. Intervening in the media somehow. Now, how we do that, that's a challenge. One is to ourselves engage, whether we're community activists or academics like myself, is to engage what I refer to as public criminology or public sociology, where I sort of take this research on the road and counter media images with my own rhetoric, my own commentary on Islamophobia and the impacts of Islamophobia, and the importance of recognizing the severity of the problem in our communities.
Dr. Barbara Perry, thank you so much for speaking to us today.
Thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
That was Dr. Barbara Perry speaking on Islamophobia. We'll take a break. When we return, we answer questions we've received from you, our viewers.